Please be seated. The court is now back in session, and the chamber will hand the floor again to the international co-prosecutor to put a question to the experts. And please repeat the last question to the expert. And the chamber would like to remind you again that when you read a quote or an extract from a document, please try to do it as slow as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Becker, did you speak to Chams before 1979 and since 1979?
Yes.
Where did you interview Chams after 1979?
Here in Cambodia.
There, we previously saw in document E3-1156, which was the report by, I believe, Ket and Mut about your visit, that you had asked to speak to Chams. Were you given the opportunity during your 1978 trip to speak to Chams?
No.
Did you see any mosques during your trip?
No.
By the way, during your trip, did you see any Christian churches?
No. In fact, the one that I knew the best, the French cathedral, right at the corner near where I used to live at the hotel, that had been completely torn down.
Just so the record is clear, that's in Phnom Penh, and can you describe the location a bit more?
It was catty-corner to the hotel, which is now called the Raffles, and it was a large cathedral, and it faced Le Phnom. So it was looking towards the river on Manivan.
Thank you. On page 226 of your book, in English, the ERN is 00233791. In French, it's at page 208, 00638488. And in Khmer, 00232301. You said another basic step was the elimination of the family as any meaningful unit of the society. Besides devising the three constitutional categories of citizens, worker, peasant, and soldier, the Khmer Rouge created other artificial categories that amounted to an unorthodox new class system that subordinated the family by ignoring it. These categories redefined identities and attitudes, shifting from family to revolutionary loyalties, or so the Khmer Rouge hoped. Can you explain what you mean when you talk about the Khmer Rouge eliminating the family as a meaningful unit of society?
That families no longer automatically lived together. Children were divided from their parents, often at very young ages. That children were discouraged from seeing their parents as their authority figures, that it would be the Khmer Rouge, the cadre, who would be the authority figure, that a married couple would not necessarily at all live together, that they could be divided, that the loyal and all those things that makes a family stay together, the parents, the children, educating, all those responsibilities that used to be parental became the state. Education, feeding, clothing, all those sorts of things, so that you ended up with situations where children would go against their parents because that would be required of them under the rules.
How did that differ from the situation in the that you observed in 1972 to 74 in Cambodia?
Oh, it was night and day. It was Cambodians had very strong families. Remarkably, you would see fathers very involved with their children in ways that you don't often see in all societies. You had distant brother cousins, a huge net for families where different familial responsibilities, and the family was the center. And it was interesting, as I know with Madame Yeng Turit, as soon as it was possible, she regrouped her family together. It's very deep, very deep.
I want to go back a moment because I forgot a question to ask you something about the Cham. You went in your visit in 1978 to Kampong Cham, is that correct?
Yes.
And you traveled by river, is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
On that trip, or in any other parts of, well, let me go back a second. You, I think, said at one point, or can you tell us, approximately how many miles or kilometers did you travel in that trip?
I believe I wrote 2,000. As I said, we spent an inordinate amount of time in cars or boats.
In all of that travel, do you recall how many persons you saw in recognizable Cham dress, wearing headscarves or the other distinctive clothing, headdresses of Cham men?
None.
I want to ask you about a passage at page 281 of your book. In English, the ERN is 00237986. In French, 00638540. And in Khmer, 00232370. You wrote July 1977, there was the first real massacre in Kompot's cooperative. Quote, before they only took the one person they suspected of something, not the family. This massacre of new people and old people, they took the whole family, all of the children, even the babies. There was 7 or 8 families taken away at once. We did not know why. First of all, who was Kampat?
May Kampot was a banker who I knew very well during the Khmer Republic period. And I tell his story throughout the book. I begin with him. His quote is the first one in the book from a Cambodian. His banker, very well educated, Canadian, French education, and he stayed on. He was one of the people who believed the Khmer Rouge would bring a great revolution, a good new government. I interviewed him at length when he, after 1979.
He discusses that children, even babies, were killed. And I just want to read to you a bit from a document, E2133. The ERN is 00242285. The Khmer original 00006728. It's a list of 18 names. The last 2 have the parentheses, in parentheses, female. And then it states, total prisoners, including 160 children, smashed by Brother Srey, are 178 persons. So we had the 18 names listed, 160 children, for a total of 178. As a person who's researched the Khmer Rouge period, do you have an explanation of why they killed children?
I can repeat the rationalization. The network system that everyone was accused through a network, and as the killing snowballed, the networks exploded from adults having relationship with other adults to a network including the entire family. That was the rationalization. But if nothing else, this is very irrational.
You mentioned at the beginning of your testimony that in addition to the book When the War Was Over, you wrote a small book about Bopana. Can you tell us about that book?
Her story is in When the War Was Over. And when I first went to the Tool Slang archives, I purposely looked for a woman victim who would have been someone I could have known when I lived there. And women are often left out of histories. So I talked to the wonderful archivist there, and I asked for Bopana's file, and they were thrilled because it was their favorite file. It's the story of a wonderful young woman who was very courageous, and the file contains her love letters to her husband, who was a cadre. Anyway, the story's told right in the middle of this book. It attracted the attention of a then young filmmaker named Ritipan, who called me up from Paris and asked if he could do a documentary based on this story. And I said, sure. I gave it to him for free. And he did his documentary, The Tragedy, a Cambodian Tragedy. He did it French, Khmer. And he fell in love with her, too. And he named that film you can see every day now, twice a day at Tool Slang. And he named the Bopana Archives that he helped co-found to reconstruct the audiovisual memory of this country, to gather all the films and photographs, and Cambodian government, the French government, everybody was helpful. And then so she became this big figure, and people wanted just a separate little book about her. So I just wrote the book for Cambodia audience only in English, French, and Khmer, and it's published by Cambodia Daily.
You mentioned that you reviewed her file at Tuol Sleng. What was in the file? How big was this file, and what did it consist of?
It's the largest file in the archives. She was kept longer than most, and from the records, she was tortured, some very severe. She was a very attractive young woman, and it's clear that she was, sexually abused. She was made to write many, many confessions. Her husband was also brought in and hurt. It's all the usual, the biography rewritten, confessions, forced to make up these networks that then would lead to other people being killed. But the cache of letters is what brought her story to life. And it's one of the few contemporary sort of like diaries of the emotional life of someone going through this. And what just strikes you is, the depth of her feelings and her ability to describe it both as a contemporary Cambodian woman with allusions to French romantic tales and, of course, the allusions to Ramayana. And at the end, she called herself Sita, in Khmer it's Seda, as the Sita to her husband. So it's an extraordinary story. And this big, and as I said, the two women archivists were absolutely thrilled that someone finally asked for her file.
And did you determine why she was brought to Tuol Sleng, and tell us her ultimate fate? She
and her husband, Det, were trying to figure out if they could live together, and secretly passing letters to each other. He was trying to secure permission for movement, and there was jealousy within her village and suspicions, so that they were caught, and for wanting to live together and trying to subvert the rules, they were both brought in, and they were both killed in Tuol Sleng.
Thank you. I just want to conclude with a couple of questions back where I began when we talked about the Khmer Rouge, and particularly Ing Tarit talking about the Vietnamese being behind the United States, cooperation between Vietnam and the CIA. On page 435 of your book, it's at ERN 00238148. The French ERN is 00238148. And I'm missing at the moment I don't have at the moment the Khmer ERN. You wrote, Brzezinski said, I encouraged the Chinese to support Pol Pot. I encouraged the Thai to help the DK. The question was how to help the Cambodian people. Pol Pot was an abomination. We could never support him, but China could. And the Brzezinski you refer to there is who? Ms. Becker.
Zbigniew Brzezinski was the National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter.
Did you verify, is what he's saying correct, that the United States encouraged China after 1979 to support Khmer Rouge forces militarily?
Well, the evidence is yes. That's a recorded interview, and the United States did play one of the foundation roles in creating this alliance between the Khmer Rouge, Sihanouk, and Son Sann, the former prime minister, who the three of them had their supporters and military people along the Thai-Cambodian border, and to become a military and political entity, which then allowed Democratic Kampuchea to be in an alliance with Sihanouk as the head, and then Democratic Kampuchea could keep its status representing Cambodia at the United Nations, among other things.
Given that he refers to Pol Pot as an abomination, why was the United States at that time willing to deal, or at least encourage others to deal and support Pol Pot's forces, even though he was aware of his horrible record?
This was the last, it turned out Cambodia became the last major piece of the Cold War to be resolved. The United States sided with China which included in this, sided with China against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union supported Vietnam. The United States supported China, which supported Democratic Kampuchea. And then within this, of course, the United States still, as I said, had such rancor against Vietnam, it was not difficult for them to be against Vietnam. And after the Vietnamese invaded and occupied Cambodia, the United States was particularly instrumental in convincing Europe to go along with a embargo against Cambodia, which many of us wrote against because it was at a time when Cambodia was just recovering from the Khmer Rouge, and for a decade it severely limited the ability of food and humanitarian aid to get into Cambodia. But at that stage it was the most severe embargo in the world against Cambodia, and it also tightened the embargo against Vietnam.
Mr. President, Your Honors, thank you. This concludes my questions. I turn it over to my civil party colleagues, please.
President, thank you, International Co-Prosecutor and the International Lead Co-Lawyers for Civil Parties. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Ms. Becker. My name is Marie Guiraud. I am one of the civil party lawyers, and we have 10 representatives of the civil parties today coming from Svay Rieng and Tak Hill provinces. I wanted to start my questioning by revisiting a document that was discussed this morning by my colleague from the OCP that lists the different requests that were yours when you arrived in Cambodia in December 1978. This document is document E3/1156. ERN Khmer 00329444. French 0080743. And English 0052458. Among the 9 requests that you formulated at the beginning of your stay in Democratic Kampuchea, at request number 7, you asked to get information on the recruitment for the army. Do you remember having formulated this particular request, asking about recruitment for the army?
Yes.
Can you therefore explain to us why you made this request? What was the information that was available to you back then with regard to recruitment for the army? And what is the information that you gathered during your trip and during the different interviews you conducted later?
The point was, I vaguely knew that there was a problem with the army because of the purges in the various zones. And by the time we arrived in Cambodia, Heng Samrin Hun Sen had already joined from the eastern zone with the Vietnamese to prepare for what became the front that came with the Vietnamese to invade. So my question was, they were facing a war, and they already had some significant loss of the soldiers who were fleeing the purge in the eastern zone and went to Vietnam, plus the presumption being that some of the military had already been lost in the purges. So who are they recruiting? How were they going to face what was going to be a very difficult battle with Vietnam?
Thank you. In order to have you react to your previous statements, did you gather information during your trip or during the interviews you conducted on the way the losses were compensated for and who was recruited into the army?
The information was more indirect than direct, but when I was on the Eastern Front with Commander Pin, it was quite clear that there were very young soldiers. And I took quite a few photographs just of the soldiers because the age was so markedly young.
Can you tell us, when you tell us that these were very young soldiers that you saw and that you photographed, can you give us more information on their age, if possible?
This is guessing, but many didn't look like teenagers. And when I mentioned it, it was very hard to get ages. So they resisted it, and it was easy. It was interesting because it was easier to get ages of the young workers at the institute than it was of the soldiers.
So, in order to conclude with this point, you asked for their age, and the people you spoke to refused to give you an answer, or they were rather vague in their answers. Is that so?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, continuing with this document, I wanted to revisit a point that was brought up by the international co-prosecutor this morning. It's point number 9 of your visit, in which you say that you wish to meet or inform yourself about the Cham population. And I wanted to know why you were particularly interested back then, before you traveled to Cambodia, in the Cham population, and what was the information that was available to you before you traveled to Cambodia on how the Cham were treated in democratic Kampuchea.
Already from the refugee reports on the border, the Chams were already pinpointed by the refugees as targets. I think, I can't remember that any other minority group had already been identified by the refugees. It was the Chams.
So, if I understood well, it is on the basis of the information that you gathered from refugees that you concluded that the issue of the Cham required further investigation. Is that so?
Yes, but I had not interviewed those refugees in Thailand. Other people had.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Now, I wanted to have you react to questions and answers that you provided yesterday with regard to Buddhism. And I wanted to use the information that you provided to us yesterday in light of the 2 years you spent in Cambodia before you traveled, before democratic Kampuchea. When you were questioned by Judge Lavergne, you said that during your stay, you had noticed that the pagodas were empty, and you said the following: yesterday at 1:33 in the afternoon, the pagodas were empty, and I saw more than one that was used as a granary. And when I asked questions with regard to the pagodas, they simply told me that it was just a reaction and that the people had lost their faith. So I wanted to have you react to this issue of Buddhism. I wanted to know if you could explain to us what Buddhism represented before in Cambodia, before 1975, in particular in light of the 2 years you spent here. What, according to you, the democratic Kampuchea regime then did with regard to Buddhism, in particular in light of what you noticed during your trip in 1978?
First, what I said yesterday was that the Khmer Rouge called it a reactionary faith. And the translator said react or something. So and this was said repeatedly. That Buddhism was a reactionary faith, and people no longer were attracted to it. And this was astonishing because the official, Buddhism was part of what Cambodia was officially, and the Sangam, the Buddhist prelates were part of the functioning of the society. There were religious minorities, but it was a proudly very Buddhist country. There was, it was so much in part of the fabric of life, from the morning when the monks would come around begging for food, to the Buddhist holidays, celebrations of weddings. The calendar, the official calendar, included the Buddhist holidays, the funerals, the pagodas. The language included Buddha. It's hard to divide it. The Buddhist Institute was one of the institutes that helped foment independence here in Cambodia. All these symbols you see. You look at the courtroom. I mean, it's Buddhist. So the idea that in 1 year, being it's reactionary, it's impossible. That they defrocked the monks, forbid the faith, and just took it out. There's no more Buddhism.
Thank you. In an article that you wrote following your visit on 29 December 1978, an article that you wrote for the Washington Post that's called in French or in English, Cambodia is seeking self-sufficiency and independence regardless of the human cost. And it's in the index of this document is E3/3391, ERN English 0044 52 57, ERN Khmer 00 70 35 43, French 00 72 91 19. And you write, with regard to this question, and I quote free translation, I also noted the complete erasure of Buddhist culture, which is the founding of the base of the Cambodian nation for centuries, which gave me the feeling that Cambodia had lost what I considered before as its soul. Can you confirm today that that is the feeling that you had when you traveled to Cambodia in December 1978?
Yes.
Merci, Madame Becker.
Thank you, Ms. Becker. Now I wanted to have you react to statements that you made yesterday when you answered certain questions put to you by Judge Lavergne, and in particular when he spoke to you about at 1:35 in the afternoon, when he spoke about the issue of family relations and marriage. And when you answered his question, you spoke about in paragraph 23, so that the parties may follow the record, you indicated that it was necessary to obtain permission to marry. And I wanted to know if you could explain to us a bit more in detail who gave you this information, and when, and upon which occasion. Were these people that you had interviewed? Were these senior leaders? Can you tell us a bit more about this information that you provided yesterday, that it was necessary to get permission to get married? Who gave this permission?
The permission came, I was told it was through the cooperative leaders, and this was a subject brought up several times, and I'm sure that Prasit was involved in this, so it would be up there, and co-op leaders. I can't tell you exactly which province I was in, but definitely.
And more generally speaking, was the issue of marriage brought up during your various discussions with senior leaders when you traveled to Democratic Cambodia?
Yes, it came up regarding when to marry in order to ensure population growth, and who should marry, and how married people lived or did not live together.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Now I would like you to react to the 3 points that you mentioned. You seem to draw a parallel, or in any case a link, between the moment of the marriage and the issue of the increase of the population. So, did I understand well? And is this a link that you made yourself? Marriage and population increase?
No, I did not make that link myself. When you said in our conversations, when did marriage came up? And marriage did come up in terms of population increase. And when would be the ideal for people to marry, and the importance to Democratic Kampuchea to increase the population.
Thank you. I will revisit this question a little bit later. I simply wanted to have you react to the two other points that you mentioned. In particular, who had to marry, and I wanted to have you react on this, and how married couples then were supposed to live together. Did you have any information on that?
Se marier.
Who got married, with whom, and how married couples lived together?
During the trip in December 1978, I didn't get all the detail I would later learn. So, and in 1978, it was simply the co-op approving of marriage. They did not talk about who decided who would marry. How to live together, I raised because I saw, particularly when I was out on my own, groups of men and dormitories that were clearly single-sex. So having heard them talk about the desire to increase the population, it seemed contradictory that I would see the single-sex, particularly male dormitories. And that's when they talked about visitations. But again, not in great detail.
Well, that was in fact the point of my next question. I wanted to have you react to an indication you gave yesterday to the chamber with regard to these visits. Who spoke to you about this, and what did you know about this back then?
I can't tell you exactly who talked to me, but sure it was Prasid again. It was simply, if I'm not mistaken, I was given, that they visited X number of times a week or X number of times a month. Generally, when I asked a question, they had numbers. They were rather, they had rules and regulations, and I remember, I think in one of those notes, there were, there are rules and regulations that X number of visits per month or week.
Thank you. And when you speak about rules and regulations, what do you mean by this? Is this a written document? Is this a document you saw? Is this a document that was shown to you? What can you tell us about this document?
No document. Rules and regulations means that when you would say, how many times do they, how much rice do they eat, then you'd always say they eat X number of kilos a month or 1 kilo, whatever. How many times do they visit? Then the answer would be X number of rules. So I'm not talking about a document or a law that I saw. I'm talking about the answers I received.
In fact, to have you react to this last point of with regard to rules and regulations, which is not a written document, but answers that were given to you, were these answers given to you in such a detailed way?
President, the International Lead Co-Lawyer for Civil Parties, please leave a sufficient pause before you start putting questions, because otherwise it will be overlapped and it will be not a proper record on the transcript. And please repeat your last question. Thank you. And also, when you refer to an extract from a document, please read it slowly. And if possible, repeat the reference number twice. And if it comes to the name, maybe your national counterpart can assist with the pronunciation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. My last question regarded these rules and regulations that you spoke to us about, and you explained to us that you were provided with answers that seemed detailed to your different questions, answers that were already known. And I wanted to know if these answers were given to you simply with regard to marriage, or if they gave you answers with regard to other topics that were discussed during your stay, for example, working conditions, the rice production, etc., etc.
Yes, and I have them in that chapter in my book. And at one stage, we just got tired of writing the same X number of desserts, X number of rice, and so on and so forth. But this is all, detailed about what is considered required.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I have a last series of questions, so maybe I'll be able to finish before the lunch break. I wanted to have you react on a concept that you brought up in your book, which is a concept that I'm going to mention in English because the French translation is not quite adequate. It's a concept. Did you already hear this term, Kampuchea worker peasant? Had you already heard this term before?
Had I heard it before I went there? Yes.
And in order to expand on that, when you were on site, did you hear this concept again? And if so, who mentioned it?
Yes, and I heard it often enough that I didn't notice.
Pouvez-vous nous...
Can you explain to us what the meaning is of this concept?
Well, as I took it, and this is from reading official Democratic Kampuchea throughout those years as they broadcast on, and I read on Foreign Broadcast Information, FIBIS. You see worker peasant throughout. I mean, it's a very common thing. And that would be that in the new class society, peasants take the role of what would have been the proletariat, the working class, in a more urbanized setting. So that in worker peasant, you have the most common basic class. That's how I understood it in context.
And according to you, did this concept involve a complete erasure of individual identity or of community identity?
This concept alone, I wouldn't say it erased individual. It's putting a lot on one concept. I mean, it's the whole class system certainly vastly diminished individuality and community, redefining it. And this is one of the building blocks.
Avez-vous...
Did you ever hear, when you discussed with the different leaders, explanations regarding purity, ethnic purity? Is this a term that came up in the different interviews you conducted? And if that is the case, can you expand on this a little bit?
what I heard was the one Cambodian nation, one Cambodian people. And when I read more about the sense of the purity than I heard, when I would ask about minorities, I was told this is one Cambodian nation, one Cambodian people.
Vous indiquez dans votre ouvrage, pour clore ce sujet, vous indiquez dans votre ouvrage en IRN.
In your book, you indicate in English ERN 00237951, in French 006385506, Khmer 00232325. And I quote you, free translation, the obsession of racial purity under the Khmer Rouge government regime. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yes, that's after all the research, particularly after the Democratic Kampuchea was overthrown, and all the research that I did and others did on the purging, the killing of minorities, and I include interviews and reference to other research. But it was very much the pure Khmer race. And as was quoted in the Cham chapter, women look alike, men look alike. You are just one Cambodian nation.
Thank you. Mr. President, I am done. Thank you very much.
President, thank you. And the International Co-Prosecutor, you have the floor.
Thank you, Your Honors. I just wanted to bring to the parties and Your Honor's attention one document. Yesterday, I read the names of 4 individuals that Ben Kiernan asked Malcolm Caldwell to inquire about before his trip to Cambodia in 1979. There's a document on the case file, E3129, in which those 4 names appear as numbers 2, 5, 6, 8. It's called Names of Prisoners Coming from France Not Yet Interrogated. It's an S21 document. So, and it indicates that each of these 4 individuals entered S21 on the 23rd of October, 1976. I'll just ask Mr. Seng Liang to read the names, please.
Seng Liang and Mr. President, on the list, the names appear at the number 2, which is Ki Kum 3, and at number 5, Lai Rose, and number 6, U Lam, and lastly, that is number 8, Chư Wood. Thank you. President, thank you. And Judge Lavange, you can proceed.
Before concluding this session, we need to make one clarification so that this should be reflected on the record. This morning, in answer to a question by the prosecutor, Mrs. Baker referred to a book written by a Cambodian who had lived underground with the Khmer Rouge, and you gave the title of this book in English. I am not sure it was translated into French. Unless I am wrong, you referred to the book titled Regrets of the Khmer Soul. And that book was written by a Cambodian called Kit Sarin, and you refer to it in your book. And the reference is E3/20, and the ERN in English is 0023 7845, and in French it is 0063 8411. I do not have the Khmer ERN. Could you please specify whether it is indeed the book you referred to this morning?
Yes.
President, thank you. It is now time for our lunch break. We will take a break now and resume at 1:30 this afternoon. Court officer, please assist the expert during the break time and have her return to the courtroom at 1:30 this afternoon, and security guards, you instructed to take Mr. Kirsampon to the waiting room downstairs and have him return to this courtroom before 1:30 this afternoon. The court is now in recess.